She disappeared without leaving behind a single scream. No shattered glass, no bloodstains, no final message. On a freezing winter morning in Utah, a woman simply ceased to exist, as if she had been erased from her own life. The silence was so complete that it felt intentional, almost rehearsed. Inside a modest suburban home, everything appeared ordinary. The beds were made, the doors locked, the children asleep. Yet Susan Powell was gone. The absence felt heavy and unnatural. This was not merely a disappearance, but an unsolved mystery, becoming a cold case. Today's story leads us into the dark past of a family that appeared stable, even ordinary, from the outside. In December 2009, Susan Powell vanished, and slowly, the person closest to her emerged as the prime suspect. The question still hangs in the air. Was the truth destroyed, or has it been waiting, quietly, for someone brave enough to listen to the silence? Utah often projects an image of safety and order, a place where life follows predictable rhythms and danger feels distant. Snow settles quietly on suburban streets, homes sit neatly aligned, and neighbors exchange polite greetings without intrusion. In these environments, violence feels abstract, something that happens elsewhere, far removed from ordinary family routines. This illusion of stability can be powerful, and sometimes it becomes a shield that hides what should never remain unseen. Susan Cox Powell lived within this carefully constructed normality. At 28 years old, she was a young mother raising 2 small boys. Juggling work responsibilities with the relentless demands of parenthood, she was known as organized, thoughtful, and practical, someone who approached life with quiet determination rather than drama. To those around her, Susan appeared grounded, focused on providing her children with consistency and safety. She was not reckless or impulsive. She was methodical, careful, and deeply invested in her role as a mother. Her daily life followed routines that many would recognize. Mornings were structured around preparing her children, commuting to work, and managing household responsibilities. Evenings were spent tending to family needs, often placing her own emotional well-being last. This pattern created an appearance of balance, yet beneath it was persistent fatigue. Susan was not simply tired from motherhood. She was emotionally worn down by a marriage that required constant vigilance rather than offering support. From the outside, her marriage to Josh Powell looked unremarkable. They owned a home, shared responsibilities, and raised children together. There were no public scenes, no visible signs of chaos. Yet stability is not defined by the absence of noise. In Susan's case, it was defined by silence, a silence that concealed tension rather than resolving it. Her relationship demanded endurance, not partnership. Susan's dreams were modest and deeply human. She wanted security, emotional warmth, and a sense of shared purpose within her family. However, financial stress and emotional distance made those dreams increasingly difficult to reach. The marriage became a source of anxiety rather than refuge. Susan confided in friends that she felt trapped, not physically, but emotionally. These confessions were measured and restrained, expressed without hysteria. They carried the weight of someone who had already accepted that change might never come. Josh Powell occupied a central role in this emotional landscape. He was introverted, socially withdrawn, and intensely private. Where Susan sought connection, Josh retreated into isolation. He appeared uncomfortable with emotional intimacy and preferred control over vulnerability. Friends and acquaintances often described him as awkward or distant. Few described him as warm. His interactions lacked ease, and his presence often carried a subtle tension that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Psychologically, Josh displayed traits associated with emotional detachment and a strong need for control. He showed limited empathy, especially when faced with opinions that differed from his own. Even mild criticism felt threatening to him. His jealousy remained quiet and indirect, often masked as concern or withdrawal rather than confrontation. Over time, this behavior created persistent unease inside the home. Susan began to feel watched instead of supported. Her independence narrowed through emotional pressure rather than force. Silence became a mechanism of control, gradually isolating her within the relationship. Their household embodied contradiction. On the surface, it functioned like any other family environment. Children's toys filled the living spaces. Daily routines continued uninterrupted. Yet emotionally, walls were forming. Arguments occurred frequently, but they were rarely loud or dramatic. Instead, they were cold, unresolved, and cyclical. these types of conflicts are often the most corrosive. They leave no visible damage, while slowly dismantling trust and emotional safety. During this period, Susan reportedly kept journals as a private refuge. She wrote about frustration, anxiety, and a deepening sense of vulnerability. Her concerns extended beyond marital failure to personal safety, reflecting intuition shaped by a prolonged emotional confinement rather than irrational fear. Domestic violence does not always announce itself through bruises or emergency calls. In many cases, it emerges quietly through control, isolation, and psychological pressure. Susan's writings suggested an awareness that something was deeply wrong, even if she could not fully articulate it. Her fear was cautious and contained, shaped by a desire to protect her children and maintain stability. The broader family environment added another layer of complexity. The Powell family dynamics were marked by dysfunction and boundary issues that further destabilized Susan's sense of security. These tensions were not widely visible, but they contributed to an atmosphere where her concerns were minimized rather than addressed. In such systems, discomfort is often normalized, and silence becomes a coping mechanism. In small town and suburban environments, silence can be mistaken for peace. Neighbors tend not to intervene. Personal matters are considered private. This cultural distance allows warning signs to remain internal, sealed behind closed doors that are never forced open. Susan's struggles unfolded quietly, without external disruption. The family looked normal, and that appearance discouraged deeper scrutiny. As months passed, Susan's emotional isolation intensified. She faced the daily challenge of maintaining normalcy while carrying an internal awareness that her situation was becoming increasingly unsafe. Yet leaving a controlling relationship is rarely simple. Financial dependency, fear of escalation, and concern for children often create invisible barriers. Susan remained, hoping for improvement, adapting to survive. By December, the emotional foundation of the Powell household had already begun to crumble. Trust was broken, communication reduced to guarded silence, and control quietly replaced intimacy. Fear lingered where partnership once existed. From the outside, nothing seemed urgent or alarming. Yet disappearances are rarely born from sudden violence alone. They are often shaped over time by isolation, emotional decay, and silence chosen over conflict. By late 2009, those conditions were fully formed, hidden beneath an increasingly fragile appearance of normal life. When Susan Powell vanished, it would shock a community that believed such things did not happen there. But the truth was more unsettling. The danger had never arrived suddenly. It had been living quietly inside the house all along, hidden behind routines, politeness, and a silence that had learned how to endure. In the days leading up to Susan Powell's disappearance, tension inside the household was no longer something that could be dismissed as routine marital stress. According to people close to her, the emotional strain had intensified. Arguments between Susan and Josh became more frequent, repetitive, and draining. The kind of conflicts that do not explode, but instead linger, unresolved and corrosive. Susan confided to friends that her marriage felt as though it was collapsing under its own weight, not because of a single event, but because of years of accumulated pressure. What made these conversations especially troubling was a shift in Susan's tone. She no longer spoke only about unhappiness or incompatibility. She spoke about fear. She told at least one friend that she was concerned for her personal safety. This detail, unremarkable at the time, would later become one of the most haunting elements of the case. Susan was not dramatic, nor prone to exaggeration. Those who knew her described her as practical and cautious. When she expressed fear, it carried weight. Despite the emotional turmoil, Susan continued to follow the rhythms of her daily life. She went to work, cared for her 2 young sons, and attempted to preserve a sense of normalcy. To co-workers and acquaintances, she appeared tired but functional. Internally, however, something was shifting. Those close to her sensed emotional withdrawal, a quiet detachment that suggested she felt overwhelmed and uncertain about what lay ahead. She seemed aware that her life was approaching a breaking point, even if she could not fully articulate what that meant. December 6, 2009, was a Sunday. According to Josh Powell, the evening unfolded in an unusual way. He later told police that he decided to take his 2 small sons on a late-night camping trip, leaving the house while Susan stayed behind. The timing and circumstances of this decision immediately raised red flags. Utah was in the grip of winter. Temperatures were freezing, and snow was falling. Taking young children camping under those conditions late at night was not only uncommon but potentially dangerous. Josh's explanation was delivered calmly, almost casually. He did not frame the trip as spontaneous or risky. He spoke as though it were a reasonable family activity, requiring little justification. To investigators, this emotional flatness stood out. Parents generally describe concern, preparation, or at least hesitation when exposing children to harsh conditions. Josh expressed none of that. His tone suggested detachment rather than awareness of risk. According to his account, Susan was alive and at home when he left. When he returned later, she was gone. This claim placed Josh as the last known person to see Susan before her disappearance. Yet there were no witnesses who could confirm his timeline. No neighbors reported seeing Susan leave. No surveillance footage captured her movements. No phone records indicated travel or communication after that night. Susan's disappearance was marked not by chaos, but by stillness. There were no signs of forced entry in the home. Doors and windows were intact. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, no visible indication of a struggle. Her personal belongings remained where they belonged. Her purse, wallet, identification, and daily essentials were untouched. These details suggested she had not planned to leave voluntarily, nor had she prepared for an extended absence. The following morning, Susan failed to appear at work. This was immediately noticed. She was known to be reliable, and her absence was out of character. Co-workers attempted to reach her without success. Family members grew alarmed. Calls went unanswered. By the end of the day, concern escalated into fear, and authorities were notified. When police entered the Powell home, they were not met with evidence, but with abstinence. The house felt lived in, yet incomplete. Susan's presence was missing in ways that were difficult to quantify. Investigators often describe such scenes as unsettling, because they offer no clear narrative. There was nothing to reconstruct, no physical trail to follow. The lack of disturbance suggested that whatever happened did not involve a sudden, visible confrontation within the home. Attention quickly turned to Josh Powell. Statistically, spouses are often the first focus in cases of unexplained disappearance. In this case, the focus intensified due to his unusual behavior. Observers noted that his emotional responses appeared muted and inconsistent. He did not display the visible distress commonly associated with a missing spouse. Instead, he remained controlled, guarded, and oddly distant. During interviews, Josh avoided direct answers. His statements contained vague descriptions and shifting aliens. Small details changed subtly from one account to another. The locations he referenced were imprecise. His explanations required clarification, yet he offered little elaboration. None of these behaviors constituted proof of guilt on their own, but collectively, they raised concern. Investigators also noted where Josh's attention seemed to rest. Rather than emphasizing fear for Susan's safety or urgency in locating her, his responses appeared self-focused. He was careful, defensive, and measured. This pattern aligns with psychological profiles in which control and self-preservation override emotional connection. In such cases, the individual's primary concern is not loss, but exposure. The alleged camping trip quickly became central to the investigation. The authorities attempted to corroborate Josh's story through phone records, vehicle data, and potential campsite searches. His vague descriptions complicated verification. Locations shifted, timelines blurred, and each explanation introduced new uncertainty rather than clarity. Despite growing suspicion, investigators confronted a decisive limitation. There was no body and no physical evidence that could directly connect Josh Powell to a crime. Without those elements, prosecutors had no legal foundation to move forward. Circumstantial concerns, no matter how disturbing, were not enough to support charges. His lack of resolution created a deep legal and psychological void. Susan was missing, but not officially dead. Josh was heavily suspected but legally free. Her family remained suspended between hope and grief, unable to find closure. For investigators, the most disturbing aspect was the absence itself. No clear crime scene, no confirmed timeline, no definitive explanation. Only silence, layered with contradictions, suggesting not chance, but careful and deliberate design. As the investigation stretched beyond its initial weeks, law enforcement attention narrowed, almost inevitably, toward Josh Powell. From a behavioral standpoint, his actions did not align with those typically observed in a distressed spouse searching for a missing partner. Analysts noted emotional flatness, evasive phrasing, and an apparent focus on protecting himself rather than locating Susan. Yet behavioral suspicion, however compelling, is not evidence. It is only a signal, and signals alone cannot sustain a prosecution. Early investigative decisions would later become points of regret. Certain items within the Powell home, initially deemed insignificant, were not preserved with the urgency hindsight would demand. Potential trace evidence, digital artifacts, and contextual clues were either overlooked or examined too late. Investigations are shaped by timing as much as intention, and in this case, early uncertainty translated into permanent informational loss. Once those moments passed, they could not be recreated. Josh was interviewed multiple times over the following months. Each interaction followed a similar pattern. He answered questions selectively, avoided specificity, and often reframed inquiries in ways that reduced his exposure. His statements were not overtly contradictory, but they shifted subtly over time. Small changes in wording, altered sequences of events, and imprecise recollections created a narrative that felt unstable without ever fully collapsing. For investigators, this was deeply frustrating. For prosecutors, it was insufficient. The absence of Susan's body remained the central obstacle. In homicide cases, physical remains often anchored timelines, establish cause of death, and connect suspects to irreversible acts. Without a body, every theory remained vulnerable. Defense attorneys could argue alternative explanations indefinitely. Susan could have left voluntarily. She could have encountered harm unrelated to Josh. She could still be alive. Each possibility, however unlikely, diluted the certainty required for charges. This legal reality produced a disturbing paradox. Josh Powell was widely suspected, scrutinized, and socially isolated, yet he remained legally untouchable. The justice system, designed to protect against wrongful conviction, appeared powerless in the face of calculated ambiguity. To the public, this felt like failure. To investigators, it was a painful reminder of procedural limits. As months turned into years, media attention intensified rather than faded. National outlets framed Susan Powell's disappearance as a haunting true crime mystery, often emphasizing the contrast between domestic normality and implied violence. Headlines highlighted Josh's odd behavior, his lack of cooperation, and the eerie circumstances surrounding Susan's last known hours. The narrative solidified quickly. In the court of public opinion, Josh was already convicted. This divergence between legal standards and public certainty created deep tension. Many viewers and readers questioned how someone so suspicious could remain free. Others cautioned against assuming guilt without proof. The case became a symbol of broader anxieties about justice, domestic violence, and the unseen dangers within private spaces. It was no longer only about Susan Powell. It was about what society fears but struggles to prove. Susan's family refused to let silence win. Her parents and siblings became relentless advocates, urging authorities to continue searching, re-examining evidence, and applying pressure. They participated in interviews, organized searches, and kept Susan's story visible. Their grief did not resolve into quiet mourning. Instead, it transformed into sustained resistance against forgetting. This persistence came at a cost. Public exposure meant reliving trauma repeatedly. Every interview reopened wounds. Every false lead renewed hope, only to extinguish it again. Yet they believed that silence favored only one person, and they were unwilling to provide it. In unresolved cases, memory becomes a form of justice, and Susan's family understood that clearly. As the years passed, several dominant theories crystallized. The first, and most widely accepted, centered on domestic homicide. According to this view, escalating marital conflict, combined with Josh's controlling tendencies, culminated in violence. Susan's documented fears, journal entries, and statements to friends reinforced this interpretation. From a psychological perspective, it aligned with known patterns of intimate partner violence, where control intensifies as perceived loss increases. The second theory proposed a meticulously planned crime rather than an impulsive act. Supporters of this hypothesis pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the ambiguous camping trip, and Josh's consistent avoidance of definitive statements. This interpretation framed Susan's disappearance as the result of long-term planning, motivated by Josh's need to maintain dominance and avoid legal consequence. In this model, absence itself was the goal. A third, more speculative theory suggested external involvement. Some questioned whether family members or acquaintances might have assisted, intentionally or unknowingly. This idea gained traction primarily because of unresolved elements, rather than concrete proof. In cases defined by absence, speculation often fills gaps left by facts. While investigators found little to substantiate this theory, its existence reflected collective discomfort with unanswered questions. Each theory offered partial clarity, yet none delivered closure. Evidence pointed in multiple directions without converging. Investigators revisited timelines, reanalyzed statements, and conducted additional searches. But the fundamental problem persisted. Without new information, the case could not advance. Public frustration grew heavier over time. Many asked why obvious suspicion could not translate into accountability. Others questioned whether institutional caution had allowed injustice to persist. Trust in the investigative process wavered, particularly among those who viewed Susan's disappearance as emblematic of systemic failure to protect victims of domestic control. The case increasingly occupied a psychological rather than procedural space. It forced observers to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily violence can remain invisible when confined to private relationships. It also highlighted how silence, when strategically maintained, can function as a shield stronger than denial. In the aftermath of Susan's disappearance, a series of events unfolded that altered the case in devastating ways. These developments did not produce new physical evidence, but they reshaped how the story was understood. Attention shifted from what could be legally proven to what actions implied. While Susan's fate remained unresolved, the illusion of ambiguity began to erode. Long-held assumptions were re-evaluated, and the emotional weight of the case deepened. What little certainty remained would soon collapse entirely, leaving behind conclusions formed not from proof, but from irreversible consequences. From a psychological standpoint, Josh Powell's behavior aligns with patterns commonly observed in individuals driven by a deep need for control. In such personalities, relationships are not experienced as reciprocal emotional bonds, but as structures that must remain predictable and subordinate to their internal order. Emotional withdrawal, secrecy, and rigidity function as defensive strategies, protecting a fragile sense of authority rather than fostering connection. For control-oriented individuals, intimacy often feels threatening. Emotional closeness introduces uncertainty, vulnerability, and the possibility of rejection. Rather than negotiating those risks, control becomes a substitute for trust. Over time, this transforms the relationship into a system where power replaces empathy. Susan's growing independence, her documentation of fear, and her attempts to assert boundaries may have been interpreted not as personal growth, but as destabilization. When control is challenged, the psychological response can be extreme. Research in trauma and personality psychology suggests that individuals who equate control with safety experience its loss as existential danger. This is not merely discomfort or jealousy, but a profound internal threat to identity. In that psychological framework, the perceived loss of authority can activate survival mechanisms typically reserved for physical danger. Such mechanisms narrow cognitive processing, moral reasoning becomes distorted, empathy recedes, and actions are evaluated primarily through the lens of self-preservation. This does not imply impulsive rage or visible chaos. On the contrary, these individuals often appear calm, calculated, and emotionally distant. Violence, when it occurs, may emerge without outward intensity, precisely because it is framed internally as necessary rather than emotional. Trauma psychology further explains how prolonged emotional isolation contributes to this distortion. When a person exists in a closed emotional system, cut off from corrective feedback and genuine intimacy, their internal narratives harden. Over time, justifications replace reflection. Actions are detached from consequences, and responsibility is reframed as inevitability. This psychological process does not excuse harm, but it helps illuminate how destructive behavior can unfold in silence rather than fury. Susan's disappearance fits this pattern of quiet erasure rather than explosive conflict. There were no reports of screaming, no signs of forced entry, no visible struggle. The absence itself became the defining feature. In cases of control-driven violence, disappearance can serve as the ultimate assertion of power. It removes the source of perceived threat while preserving the illusion of normalcy. Buddhist philosophy offers a parallel framework for understanding this trajectory. Within Buddhist teachings, suffering arises from three core poisons: attachment, aversion, and ignorance. In this context, attachment manifests as clinging to control and possession. Aversion appears as resentment toward perceived betrayal or loss. Ignorance reflects a refusal to acknowledge impermanence, the reality that relationships, roles, and identities inevitably change. When these forces converge, destructive outcomes become more likely. The inability to release control creates suffering not only for others, but for the individual themselves. The attempt to freeze reality in a fixed state ultimately leads to collapse. In Susan's case, the refusal to accept change may have fueled a psychological environment where elimination felt preferable to adaptation. From a Christian theological perspective, silence carries profound moral significance. Confession is not merely an admission of guilt, but a pathway to redemption and reconciliation. The refusal to speak truth sustains separation, not only from others but from one's own conscience. Guilt, when suppressed rather than confronted, becomes isolating and corrosive. Within Christian doctrine, silence does not eliminate judgment, it postpones it. Truth is never extinguished, even when concealed, but continues to exist beneath the surface, exerting moral and spiritual pressure over time. In this understanding, the refusal to confess does not absolve responsibility. Instead, it prolongs the moment of reckoning, allowing unresolved guilt to persist, and often forcing the innocent to bear the emotional, spiritual, and relational consequences of a truth left unspoken. Susan's case remains unresolved in the most literal sense. No body has been recovered. No definitive account of her fate has been legally established. This absence has become the case's enduring legacy. Her family continues to exist within a space of unanswered questions, a psychological state often described as ambiguous loss. Unlike grief tied to death, ambiguous loss offers no closure, no rituals, no finality. Research shows that ambiguous loss is among the most psychologically distressing forms of trauma. It traps individuals between hope and despair, preventing emotional resolution. Susan's loved ones are unable to mourn fully, yet unable to believe completely in a return. This suspended state extends suffering indefinitely. On a societal level, the case exposes broader systemic vulnerabilities. Susan expressed fear. She documented concerns. She sought support. Yet emotional abuse, particularly when subtle and non-physical, is frequently minimized or misunderstood. Warning signs were recognized but not acted upon with urgency. Silence was mistaken for stability. Control was misinterpreted as personality. These failures are not unique to one case. They reflect cultural blind spots regarding domestic power dynamics and psychological coercion. Systems designed to intervene often rely on visible harm, overlooking the cumulative damage of emotional confinement. By the time physical evidence is sought, it may already be too late. Media coverage intensified the complexity of the case. Public opinion moved quickly towards certainty, shaped by emotion and repeated exposure. While legal systems remained bound by strict standards of proof, this growing divide created frustration, suspicion, and distrust in the investigative process. As time passed, the case shifted away from verifiable facts and toward interpretation, assumption, and belief. The absence of resolution allowed narratives to form independently of evidence, turning the investigation into a psychological battleground between legal restraint and emotional conviction. Ultimately, Susan Powell's disappearance forces a philosophical reckoning. When truth is never spoken, does justice still exist? Or does it dissolve into memory, speculation, and unresolved grief? Legal justice may remain unattainable, but moral truth persists, carried by those who refuse to forget. Susan's silence continues to echo, not through noise or spectacle, but through its persistence. It endures because it was never answered, and in that endurance lies the quiet weight of a life removed without explanation, leaving behind questions that refuse to fade. The story of Susan Powell is not defined by violence, but by absence. It is shaped by what was not seen, not said, and not resolved. Fear in this case does not come from graphic acts, but from the realization that silence can conceal profound harm. This case reminds us that domestic isolation is not harmless, that emotional control can be as dangerous as physical force, and that warning signs are often visible long before tragedy occurs. When they are ignored, silence becomes complicity. If this story leaves you unsettled, it should. Unresolved cases challenge our belief in closure and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about control, empathy, and responsibility. If you found value in this analysis, remember to like, share the video, and subscribe for more deep explorations into criminal psychology. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mind.